The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and Nora read it twice before she let herself believe it said what it said. The firm was reviewing her position. That was the phrase Diana used, reviewing, the way a surgeon uses the word discomfort. It did not say terminated. It said reviewed. And the space between those two words was exactly large enough for Nora to keep doing her job, while knowing that the floor beneath it was no longer solid. She folded the letter into thirds, tucked it into the inside pocket of her coat, and walked out to the east fence where Felix was patching a section of post and rail that the previous week's wind had pulled loose. He had a coffee in one hand and a fencing staple in the other, and he looked up when he heard her boots on the gravel. "Bad news?" he said. "Possibly," she said. He nodded and went back to the post. That was the thing about Felix. He understood when a word was enough. The estate sat on 60 acres of mixed ground outside a town called Harwick, 2 hours north of the city. Stone walls, a manor house with 8 rooms nobody used, a carriage barn that had been converted to storage, and grounds that had spent at least 3 years in a state of managed neglect. Managed was generous. The firm that handled the absent owner's affairs sent a maintenance budget in quarterly installments, and the budget had been calibrated for appearance rather than for actual care. The gutters needed relining. The east fence had been posting a slow surrender to the weather since spring. The kitchen garden's drainage had failed 2 winters ago, and no one had addressed it. Nora had been hired 11 months earlier as on-site estate manager, which in practice meant she was the only person present with authority over the property, and no authority whatsoever over the money. That authority resided with Diana Voss, senior partner at Harwick Whitfield Property Management, who visited the estate approximately once every 6 weeks, stayed for no more than 90 minutes, and used every one of those 90 minutes to find something Nora had done incorrectly. The property had an owner. His name appeared on the title documents, on the maintenance authorizations, on every letter the firm sent to the estate address. Edward Brooks. 3 years of ownership and not a single visit. Not a phone call routed through the estate line, not a handwritten note forwarded through Diana's office, not one indication that the 60 acres, the stone house, the carriage barn, and the failing kitchen garden drainage meant anything to him beyond a line item in some larger accounting. Nora had stopped wondering about him by midsummer. She had started briefly in her first weeks, the way anyone starts wondering about an absence that defines the space they work in. Then she stopped, because wondering about Edward Brooks accomplished nothing, and the east fence was still losing its argument with the weather. The estate had 4 workers who came irregularly, a handyman named Pete who drove out from Harwick twice a week, 2 seasonal labourers who had finished their autumn work and would not return until spring, and Felix, who was year-round, full-time, and who had been on the property longer than Nora. Felix had been hired 3 years ago. The same month Edward Brooks had taken possession of the title. He did not talk about the owner. When Nora had once carefully asked him what he knew, Felix had looked at the middle distance for a moment and said only that the man had seemed like someone carrying something heavy the one time he'd met him, and that was as much as he offered. The day the man who called himself Ward arrived, Nora was in the kitchen garden trying to determine whether the drainage problem was correctable without excavating the entire west bed. She had a hand trowel, a notebook, and a growing conviction that it was not. He came up the drive on foot, which was unusual. Most people who came to the estate had a reason and a vehicle. He had a canvas messenger bag over one shoulder and wore a jacket that had seen weather, the kind of jacket that had been good once and had settled into being serviceable. He stopped at the edge of the kitchen garden and looked at the ground before he looked at her. "Drainage issue?" he said. 3 years deep," she said without looking up. "The outflow pipes likely collapsed under the west corner. That clay soil moves in the freeze. She did look up then. He had a level, specific way of looking at things. Not at her, but at the garden bed. The way someone looks at a problem they have thought about before. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, brown-haired with the kind of face that was easy to forget if you weren't paying attention. "You the surveyor?" she said. "Ward," he said. "The firm sent me to assess the grounds." She had not heard from Diana about a surveyor, but that was not unusual. Diana's communications were selective about what Nora needed to know in advance. "The grounds assessment is overdue," she said. "I'll walk you through the east fence first. There's been post failure and I want it documented." He said fine, and followed her, and spent the better part of the morning making notes in a small wire-bound pad that he held rather than set down. He asked precise questions, the kind that came from actually looking at something rather than from a standard checklist. When Pete arrived mid-morning to replace a section of gutter trim on the east face of the house, Ward held the ladder without being asked. Nora noticed that. She did not remark on it. The small kindness moment, when it came, arrived the way such moments usually did, sideways inside something practical, with no one of apparent consequence watching. Pete finished the gutter work by early afternoon and presented Nora with his invoice for the labour and the trim material. The labour was in the budget. The trim material was not, because the budget allowance for exterior maintenance had been exhausted in September by a roof repair Diana had approved without adjusting the line item below it. The shortfall was $40 and some change. Pete was 63 years old, drove a truck with a cracked windshield, and had 2 adult children he was quietly helping support. He did not ask for the money to be expedited. He folded his invoice, put it in his shirt pocket, and said he'd send it through the firm's payment portal, which both of them knew meant waiting 6 to 8 weeks for Diana's office to process it. Nora went inside, opened her own account on her phone, and transferred Pete $40.30. She came back out, told him the material portion was covered directly, and to adjust the portal submission to labour only. Pete looked at her for a moment. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. She recorded it in her own notebook. $40.30, personal advance, east gutter trim material. She had done this kind of thing 4 times since she'd started. The running total was now $430, all of it receipted, all of it waiting for the moment Diana's office found a category for it. She was not holding her breath. Ward was at the edge of the kitchen garden when she came back outside, looking at the west corner with his hands in his jacket pockets. "The outflow pipe," he said, not turning around. "I know," she said. "It's not in the current budget." "What would it cost to fix it?" She gave him the number she had already looked up. Around $350 to excavate and replace the section, assuming no surprises in the clay. He wrote it in his pad. She watched him write it and thought, as she sometimes did, about surveyors and assessors and the various professionals the firm sent through the property, that he had the manner of someone who would put the number in a report that would sit in Diana's inbox until Diana decided whether or not it was worth acting on. She was not wrong about that exactly. She was wrong about almost everything else. He stayed on the property. That was the first unusual thing. Surveyors came for a day, 2 at most. He came back the following morning, and the morning after that, and within 3 days it was clear that the grounds assessment was either extremely thorough or something else entirely. He did not explain himself, and Nora did not ask. The work was real. He identified 3 additional drainage issues, marked the east fence post failures with orange tape, and spent half a morning on his back under the carriage barn's converted loft, examining a beam she had reported as suspect in her last maintenance memo. Diana arrived on the Thursday of that first week. She arrived with her coat belted and her manor already assembled, the way Diana always arrived, as though the estate were a meeting that had started without her permission. She was perhaps 10 years older than Nora, with the particular composure of someone who had learned to make other people feel slightly behind. Harriet Lowe, Diana's associate, came behind her carrying a tablet and wearing an expression of careful attention. Nora met them in the front hall. Diana did not say hello. She said, "I need to see the accounts from the past month," and then walked into the estate office without waiting. Nora followed. She laid the accounts folder on the desk, open to the current month, and Diana paged through it with one finger moving down each column, while Harriet stood near the door, making small, confirmatory sounds. Diana stopped at the page that showed Pete's adjusted invoice. "You paid $430 out of a personal account," she said. "I did," Nora said. "In 4 separate advances over 11 months, all receipted, all directed toward labor costs and minor materials that fell outside the available budget allocation." "That's not how the budget works." "I know how the budget works," Nora said. "The budget didn't cover a contractor waiting 6 weeks for $40 in trim material. You don't have authorization to disperse personal funds toward property expenses. The expenses were real and the work was done." "That's not the point, Nora." Diana's voice dropped slightly, which was the way she prepared for something she wanted to land. "The point is that you made a financial decision for this property without authorization, and you documented it inside the official accounts as though it were a reimbursable expense. That is not a clerical question. That is a question of whether you can be trusted to stay in your lane." Felix was outside the window. Nora could see him in her peripheral vision, not close, not listening, but present, moving slowly along the gravel with a barrow. She kept her eyes on Diana. "The documentation is transparent," she said. "Every item is receipted and the total is accurate. If the firm chooses not to reimburse, I'll absorb the cost." "I'm not concerned with the cost," Diana said, which was the tell, the small word that meant she was concerned with something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with $430. "I'm concerned with the pattern." Ward was visible briefly in the hallway, passing the open office door. He did not stop. Nora glanced at him once and looked back at Diana. "I'll note your concern in writing," Nora said. Diana held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then closed the folder. "We'll discuss the implications of this review at a later date," she said, which was how Diana ended conversations she hadn't won, but wasn't ready to lose. Ward was in the carriage barn when Nora found Felix that evening. They were standing near the east fence, and the light was nearly gone. And Nora said what she said because she was tired and because Felix was the only person in 60 acres she trusted to hold a private word. "You know what gets me," she said, "is that she talks about him like he's a presence, the owner. Like his preferences matter and his estate standards matter and his expectations matter. 3 years, and the man hasn't set foot on this property. He doesn't know what's broken. He doesn't know what it costs. He lets a firm manage it for him and signs whatever they send and never asks a single question. And somehow his standards are the standard I'm supposed to be held to." Felix said nothing, which was his way of listening. "A man who won't come and face the thing he owns," she said. "There's a word for that." She did not say the word then. She said it a moment later, quietly, not dramatically. "He's a coward," she said. "He bought 60 acres and a stone house and then backed away from it and let it deteriorate and let people like Pete wait 6 weeks for $40 because he can't be troubled to actually look at what he has. That's cowardice. That's what it is." She heard something shift in the carriage barn. Not a loud sound, a soft one like a boot on stone, deliberate rather than accidental. She turned and looked at the barn's open side door. Ward was standing just inside it, far enough back that he'd been in shadow, near enough that the words had reached him with perfect clarity. She felt the cold move through her separately from the evening air. Ward came out of the barn. He walked toward the fence at the same pace he always walked, and he looked at her with an expression that was not anger, not embarrassment, not the particular tight neutrality of someone who had been wounded and was choosing not to show it. It was something more considered than any of those. He said, "Good night," to both of them and went back toward the house. Felix looked at Nora. Nora looked at the ground. "How long was he there?" she said. "A while," Felix said. The next morning he was at the kitchen garden again when she arrived with her trowel and her notebook. He was looking at the west corner. The morning was cold and the grass had a thin crust of frost on the shaded side of the beds. He said, "I heard what you said last night." She had known he would address it. She had spent most of the night arranging herself for it. "I know," she said. "I'm not going to tell you you were wrong," he said. "I'd like to know what would change it." She looked at him. "Change what?" "Your view of the absent owner." His voice was even, not defensive, not pointed, not performing anything. The question was a real question. "I don't know you well enough to talk about that," she said. "All right," he said. "Tell me when you do." That was the opening, and over the 14 days that followed it, stayed open. She did not walk through it directly. She walked around it, and alongside it, and the conversation they were having was almost never the conversation on the surface. He was present for every working day, moving through the estate with the methodical patience of someone who had decided to look at everything. He helped Felix replace the damaged section of east fence, 4 posts and 12 feet of rail, and did the work without announcement, arriving with the materials already sourced and the right tools in his bag. He went under the carriage barn's loft again, this time with a hydraulic jack, and addressed the suspect beam with a temporary support that bought the structure another season. He spent one full morning sitting with the kitchen garden drainage problem, and at the end of it came to Nora with a hand-drawn diagram of a corrected outflow route that used the natural slope of the yard to eliminate 2/3 of the excavation cost. She looked at the diagram for a long time. The lines were drawn in the same small, economical hand as everything else he had written in her sight, and the contour notation along the right margin had been done in the kind of pencil that holds its point against rough paper, the kind of pencil a person who does this work often keeps in the inside seam of a coat pocket. She set the diagram on the kitchen counter beside the trowel and the maintenance notebook. "Where did you learn to do this?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I've owned property," he said. He said it the way a person says a fact that does not invite the next question, and she let the next question wait, because she had learned in her 11 months on the estate that questions could keep, and that the right ones answered themselves when the time was correct. He tapped the diagram once at the place where the outflow turned. "If we run the line along the existing slope here, the trench is shorter, and the soil is the same all the way through. The clay won't argue with it," she said. "And the west bed?" He said, "The west bed will need a French drain at the high corner. It will not be elegant. It will work for 10 winters." She said, "I have not had the budget for elegant in 3 seasons. Working for 10 winters is the only category I am interested in." The corner of his mouth did the thing that was not quite a smile. He folded the diagram in half, along a clean crease, and slid it into the maintenance notebook so the lines would not be lost. Felix liked him. That was not a small thing. Felix was not a person who expressed opinions about people, but Nora could see it in the way he moved around Ward, the particular ease of 2 people who were used to working alongside competence and recognized it without ceremony. The next morning, Felix came to the kitchen with 2 coffees in his hands at 7:15, which was earlier than he usually came inside, and set one of them on the counter beside Ward's diagram without looking up. and went out to the east fence with the second one. Ward arrived 10 minutes later, looked at the cup on the counter, looked at Nora, and picked it up without comment. Nora said, "Felix brought it." Ward said, "I gathered." She watched them one afternoon carry a section of the replaced fence rail to the carriage barn's storage area together, both moving without instruction or communication, adjusting their pace to the weight without discussion. And she thought that there was a version of the world in which this was simply what the estate looked like when it was being cared for, and that she had not expected to find that version. She watched them the next morning bring up the long-handled rake and the digging bar from the lower shed for the kitchen garden work, the two of them coming up the slope together with the tools angled across their shoulders, the way men carry tools when the weight has become familiar. And she stood at the kitchen window with a hand on the frame and let the watching be its own small kept thing. She told him about the drainage accounts one evening, not the entire story, but the part she had been turning over. She told him about the $430, the receipts in her notebook, the conversation with Diana, the way Diana had used the word authorization as though it were a synonym for loyalty. He listened without interrupting. "Do you think you were wrong?" he said when she'd finished. She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "I think it was the right thing to do, and it will be used against me." "Those can both be true," he said. She looked at him, and there was a moment that was not a proximity beat in any staged sense, just a moment when she saw that he had understood the whole thing and was not going to offer her a consolation, because she hadn't asked for one and didn't need it, and the absence of the consolation was its own kind of recognition. "You asked me what would change my view," she said after a while. He said, "I remember." "This changes it," she said. "Being here, looking at the thing, asking the questions that should have been asked 3 years ago. Whatever your reasons were for not doing it sooner, the fact that you're doing it now is different from not doing it at all." She meant the owner, she thought. She meant that if the absent Edward Brooks had sent someone like Ward to really look at the estate, that would be different from the quarterly checks and the managed neglect. He was quiet for a moment. "What if the reasons were simple?" he said. "What if the person just didn't know how to face something that was supposed to mean something, and was afraid that looking at it would confirm what they feared? That it had deteriorated," she said, "that it would be too late to fix." She looked at the east fence, newly repaired, the orange tape gone, the replaced posts pale against the older ones. "Nothing here is past fixing," she said. He did not respond to that immediately, and she did not push it, and they stood together at the edge of the repaired fence until the temperature dropped enough to send them inside separately. Over the following days, she noticed small things that she had no framework to explain. The way he moved through the house when he came inside to review a maintenance item, not like a contractor reviewing a work site, but like someone taking inventory of something personal. The way he looked at the carved mantelpiece in the front sitting room, one hand resting briefly on the stone surround, not examining it, but touching it. She caught him once standing at the window that looked out over the full extent of the grounds, 60 acres from the east fence to the northern oaks, and his posture was not the posture of a man assessing acreage. It was the posture of someone who had been away for a long time. She stored that observation in the same place she stored other things she did not yet have an explanation for, and kept working. Felix came to her one afternoon near the end of the second week and said, carefully, that she might want to think about what she knew and what she didn't know about Ward's actual assignment. She looked at him. "Say that plainly," she said. "He knows things about this property," Felix said, "that aren't in any surveyor's brief. He knows the history of that east fence. He knows which rooms were locked when the estate was handed over. He knows the name of the man who built the carriage barn." She thought about this. Did Diana send him? Felix tilted his head. The way he tilted it said, "Think about it differently." She spent the rest of the afternoon thinking about it differently. She was in the estate office the next morning when she heard a car on the gravel drive and looked out the window to see Diana's silver car followed by a second, smaller vehicle she didn't recognize. She watched Diana emerge, then Harriet, and then she straightened and placed both hands flat on the desk for a moment, the way you do when you are preparing for something you cannot stop. They came through the front door without knocking. Diana had the manner of someone who had rehearsed the morning. "Nora," she said, "we need to have a direct conversation." They gathered in the estate office. Harriet set her tablet on the edge of the desk. Ward was not inside as far as Nora knew. Felix was outside somewhere, presumably visible through the window. Diana sat down across from Nora. She had a printed document. 2 pages. "The firm has completed its review of your tenure as on-site manager," she said, using a cadence that was slightly slower than her normal speech, the cadence of a prepared statement. "There are a number of concerns relating to financial decisions made without authorization, specifically the personal disbursements documented in the estate accounts, totaling $430. She said the number with a particular precision that was designed to make it sound larger than it was. These disbursements were made to contractors working under the firm's management and were recorded in official accounts in a manner that implies the firm's obligation to reimburse, which was not authorized and was not discussed. Nora said, "They were receipted and marked as personal advances. Nothing in those records implies the firm's obligation." Diana continued as though Nora had not spoken. "The firm considers this a breach of the terms of your engagement and is exercising its right to end the management arrangement, effective the end of this calendar month. You'll have access to the property through the transition period to ensure continuity of ongoing maintenance records." She placed the 2-page document on the desk in front of Nora. Nora looked at it. She did not pick it up. There was a sound from the hallway. Not a dramatic sound, not a purposeful entrance. It was the sound of someone who had been in the house for some time and had heard enough. Ward came to the office doorway. Diana looked at him the way she looked at all service personnel, a quick registering glance that classified and dismissed. "Can you give us a moment?" she said. He did not move from the doorway. "I'll need a moment first," he said. His voice was exactly the same as it always was. Level. Slightly clipped. The voice of someone who did not need the room to go quiet, but who had noticed it did anyway. There was a knock at the front door, which no one had been expecting. Harriet moved to answer it, came back 30 seconds later with a courier's envelope and the look of someone who did not know what to do with what she was carrying. "It requires a signature," she said. "The addressee is the owner of record." She looked at the label. "Edward Brooks." Diana said, "The property owner isn't present. We handle all correspondence on his behalf." Harriet said carefully, "The courier says it requires the owner's personal signature. He won't release it to an agent." The room was very quiet. Ward stepped forward and took the envelope from Harriet. He signed for it, unhurried, in the space marked owner of record, and handed it back to the courier, who had come as far as the doorway. Nora watched his hand on the pen. She had seen that handwriting before. Not his name, because he had not signed his name anywhere she could see. She had seen the quality of his handwriting, the particular economy of it, in the wire-bound pad he carried, in the hand-drawn diagram of the drainage correction, in the notes he had made in the margin of the maintenance memo she had given him on day 3 of his stay. She looked at his face. He looked back at her, and the gap, the one the audience had been carrying since the first morning at the kitchen garden, closed without a sound. Diana said, "I'm sorry, what is happening?" Her voice had changed in a small but complete way. The prepared cadence was gone. She was working without a script now, and she knew it. "I'm the property owner," he said. "Edward Brooks. I've been staying here under a working name to assess the state of the estate." Diana looked at him. She looked at Harriet. Harriet was studying the tablet as though it might provide guidance. "You were," Diana said. Then she stopped. She tried again. "The firm has managed this estate for 3 years under a full management contract. All decisions regarding staffing have been made under that mandate." "Yes," he said, "I'm aware." "The dismissal of the on-site manager is within the firm's contracted authority." "The dismissal was filed this morning," he said. "The contract can be terminated by the property owner with 30 days' notice. I'm giving that notice now." There was a long pause. Not the kind of pause that precedes a response, but the kind that follows the realization that the responses one had prepared are no longer useful. Diana said, "You've been here. A statement, not a question." "For how long?" 14 days, he said. She looked at Nora with an expression that Nora had never seen on her face before. It was not anger. It was the expression of someone who had made a careful, confident assessment and had now watched that assessment fail in front of a witness. "The $430, Diana said, and her voice was lower now, was documented correctly. "Yes," Nora said. "It was." Harriet was already moving toward the door with the particular focus of someone who has identified an exit. Diana looked at the 2-page dismissal document still on the desk, still unread by Nora. She reached out and picked it up. She folded it once along its center crease. She placed it in her coat pocket. She said to Edward, "I'll have the management accounts transferred by the end of the week." "That would be appreciated," he said. She left. The silver car made its sound on the gravel, then the smaller vehicle, and then there was nothing but the estate in the late morning quiet, which was not a silence so much as a return to the sound of 60 acres being what they were. Nora sat in the estate office chair. She had not sat down during the entire exchange. Now she sat because her legs had arrived at a reasonable opinion about what the last 5 minutes had required of them. Edward came into the office and sat across the desk. Not in Diana's chair. He brought the wooden side chair from against the wall, the one Pete used when he came in to review a work order. He said, "The drainage diagram stands. The repair is authorized from today." She looked at him. "I owe you $430, he said. "You don't have to do that today," she said. "I know," he said. Felix knocked at the office door, which was already open. He looked between them with the expression of a man who had waited patiently for a situation to resolve itself and was now quietly satisfied. "The east fence is done," he said. Edward looked at him. "I know," he said. "You did good work." Felix looked at Nora, and there was something in his expression that was close to the smile he almost never allowed himself. And he went back out to the grounds. She spent the rest of the afternoon doing what she always did, which was to say she walked the property with her notebook and her trowel and looked at what needed looking at. The kitchen garden's west bed still had its drainage problem. The carriage barn's temporary beam support would need a permanent solution before winter. There were 3 items on the deferred maintenance list that could now move forward, and she wrote them down in order of weather sensitivity, which was how she always organized them. Edward walked with her for part of it, not all of it, because she had work to do and he had calls to return, and the estate had its own rhythms that did not pause for recalibration. He walked with her along the east fence, the new posts set pale against the old ones, the rail running clean and level across the slope. She asked him, at some point along the fence, why he had stayed away for 3 years. He was quiet for a moment. The question was the question she had already heard him gesture toward, in the conversation about reasons and about facing things, and about whether it was too late to fix them. "My father bought this estate," he said. He died 6 months after the sale closed. He never saw it. I inherited it, and I couldn't come here without walking into something he'd decided and never followed through on. He paused. It felt like another thing he'd left unfinished. She thought about that. The stone house with every curtain drawn, 3 years of managed neglect, a maintenance budget calibrated for appearance. "That's not cowardice," she said. "That's grief." He looked at her. "You were right the first time," he said, but not with bitterness, more the way you acknowledge a fair account. Grief is only an excuse if you let it become one. I let it become one. "And now," she said. He looked at the grounds, the 60 acres, the oaks at the north edge, the carriage barn, the stone house with its curtains finally open on the south-facing rooms, because she had opened them in September, when the morning light became worth letting in. "Now I'm here," he said. They walked back toward the house as the afternoon shifted into its final hour. The light went amber, then bronze, the way it did in October when the sky finally cleared after a week of grey. Felix was putting the barrow away in the carriage barn. He raised one hand as they passed and did not look back. Nora stopped at the door to the front hall. This was the threshold she had crossed 11 months ago with a hired manager's sense of professional obligation, and she had crossed it every day since in the same spirit, and it had never felt like anything other than the entrance to work she believed in and was grateful for. She did not know exactly what it felt like now. She knew it felt different. Edward stopped behind her. He said quietly, "I'd like to ask you something." She waited. "If I were to remove the firm entirely and manage the estate directly," he said, "I'd need someone with an existing relationship with the property. Someone who knows where the drainage goes wrong and why the east fence fails in a west wind, and which contractors will do honest work for what they're paid." He paused. "I'd want that to be your decision, not a default." She looked at the grounds behind her. 60 acres in the bronze late light, the east fence standing clean, the kitchen garden west bed waiting for its repair, Felix's boot prints in the dew-soft grass near the carriage barn. She looked at Edward. "Ask me again after the drainage is fixed," she said. He almost smiled. It was not quite a smile. It was the expression of a man who had received an answer he trusted more than yes. She stepped inside. The house held the warmth of a fire Felix had started in the sitting room that morning, and the mantelpiece stone was pale in the low light, and the cracked mug on the estate office desk still held the last inch of a coffee she'd made at 7 and forgotten before 8. She picked it up, poured it into the sink, and set it back down. The grounds were quiet. The fence was fixed. The drainage repair was finally authorized. The outflow pipe under the west corner of the kitchen garden would come out of the ground and back into the ground properly, and the clay soil would stop defeating the winter freeze. $430, all receipted, all waiting. The estate had an owner who was here.